Alright, let's not spend too long on the intro. The title feels pretty self-explanatory. As well as discussing some common misconceptions about the Vikings in this video and why they're dumb and wrong, I'm going to be pointing out where these misconceptions actually came from and how they spread. That should make this video a bit more interesting than the reams and reams of Viking misconception videos and articles already out there. The misconceptions are going to be in a rough order, beginning with the most well-known and commonly debunked misconceptions and ending with some that still have their anachronistic teeth firmly buried in our collective imagination. Let's start with the certified classic. The behorned Viking warrior. I think everyone with even a passing knowledge of this period of history knows this one is bunk, but I'm going to ramble on about it anyway. Right off the bat, I should point out the problem with this concept. Having big sticky outy bits on your armour is generally a terrible idea, and isn't a thing seen often in real historical records, unless you're one of these fellas. Think about the ergonomic nature of a horned helmet for a moment. Have you tried wearing a very tall or wide hat? Was it easy to move while wearing it? Did it have a tendency to get caught on door frames? Now imagine running with these big bulky counterweights sticking out of your head, or trying to climb a ladder. Imagine standing as part of a shield wall, all of your fellow soldiers also wearing these monstrosities. Imagine the horrific tangled human rat king you'd turn into. Even ignoring the bulky nature of a horned helmet, wearing something with two helpful handles for an enemy to grab onto is just not a good idea, is it? On the historicity front, we have no artistic depictions or written accounts from that time that supports the idea that Viking warriors wore horned helmets. However, we have made one interesting horny discovery from the land of the Vikings. In 1942, a peat cutter digging in a bog near Vesko, Denmark, unearthed this. Now that's a real, genuine horned helmet from real, genuine Danish ground. The helmet actually dates from around 900 BCE, a whole millennium and a bit before the people we call Vikings came on the scene. The helmet's design work shares motifs with symbolism from Sardinia. This suggests a Bronze Age trade link between the Scandinavians and Sardinians. I should point out that at least one historian is skeptical of the helmet being Sardinian inspired. His reason being that any seafaring traders going between these locations would have had to pass by these bits, and no similar helmets have been found in those places. But whether the Vesko helmets were inspired by Mediterranean ones or not, they certainly weren't ever on the head of a Viking, and they weren't used in battle either. They likely would have been worn for ritualistic purposes, like this thing, or this, or this. These helmets aren't the source of the myth though. The horned helmets trope has been knocking around for a while before 1942. In 1879, the complete ring cycle, all four parts of Richard Wagner's epic musical drama, were performed together for the first time. The dramas are very loosely sort of kind of based on Norse sagas, with a little bit of non-Norse Germanic legend thrown in. The costume designer, Carl Emil Doppler, was instructed to take inspiration from Stone and Bronze Age Nordic artifacts. Somehow, this ended up coming out as stick horns and wings on their helmets. Wagner was less than pleased with the designs that he'd come up with. In fact, he thought they were tacky But now the costumes had already been made, they were used in the performance and subsequent performances of the ring cycle. It's important to note that the ring cycle may not have been the first artistic work to feature Viking horned helmets, and neither Doppler nor Wagner himself ever made the claim that actual Vikings wore horns to battle. But the ring cycle was performed all over Europe, and itself became an inspiration for later works. Depictions of horned helmets began to spread, looting and pillaging their way across the popular European culture of the 19th century. Wagner and Doppler had inadvertently given rise to one of the most iconic historical memes. This is another one of those myths that aren't quite believed anymore by the majority of the general public. At this point, the Horn Cup has more associations with the Vikings than them drinking out of skulls. But it does tend to pop up in works about the Vikings in a similar way to horned helmets. Skull cups are featured in this 1855 poem by Matthew Arnold, a comic and animated Asterix story, and probably most irritatingly in this otherwise solid Horrible Histories musical number. As far as I can make out, there are three separate things driving this myth. Firstly, the fact that drinking out of human skulls is a real thing that actual historical maniacs once did. Secondly, this mistranslation error by the hilariously named 17th century linguist Ole Worm. In 1636, Worm published research on runes, where he made reference to this poem. This is the one where Ragnar Lodbrok gets thrown in a bunch of snakes, by the way. There's a line in the poem saying that in Valhalla, ale will be drunk from the branches of skulls, meaning the horns of cattle. Basically drinking horns, as mentioned earlier. Worm translated this passage as, ale will be drunk from skulls. Bad Worm. Thirdly, although I should add that this one is more conjecture on my part, but I think it's a very compelling idea. The phrase skull being associated with Vikings might have added to the cranial cup confusion. Vikings saying skull is actually another myth in and of itself. The words skull and skull do look similar, and since any scene from fiction where you'll hear the phrase skull usually involves drinking, I think it's probable that more than a few people have picked up the misconception from this phrase. Before we move on to a slightly less grisly but just as morbid topic, I should point out that there's a bit in the Poetic Edda where a skull cup does make an appearance. The cruel king Nidhad, I think that's how you say that, severed the hamstrings of a blacksmith called Wayland, then imprisoned and enslaved him. As revenge, Wayland kills the king's sons, gilds their skulls with silver and jewels, and presents them to the king as drinking cups. Though the Vikings themselves didn't do the skull cup thing, they did appreciate a good story featuring one. Staying very much in the realm of bones for this one, albeit charred ones. But are they really as charred as we assume? They aren't. Unless... In case some of you aren't aware, the popular image of a classic Viking send-off involves a crowd of mourners encircling a longship wreathed in flame, the dead fella lying inside of a sword and various other Viking-y things, and the funeral takes place at night, so the flames look extra striking. Or maybe it's not quite as grand a display. Maybe the star of the funeral gets sent out onto the fjord in a rowboat, which is then set alight with a flaming arrow. Unlike horned helmets and skull cups, this scene wasn't thrust into the popular imagination hundreds of years after the Viking Age. In fact, it comes from the Viking Age itself. There is one historical account of the classic burning longship funeral. The Arabic traveller Ibn Fadlan witnessed one during his time with the Vikings of the Volga River. Remember that guy, he'll make an appearance later on. There is also one mention of a burning ship funeral in Norse mythology. The god Balder was placed in a burning ship after being mistletoed to death by Loki. There have been a few excavated burial sites with charred items in them. I couldn't find any sources of the version where the deceased is stuck in a rowboat and then they do the flaming arrow thing. So it seems that the classic Viking funeral did happen on occasion for very important figures. But it certainly wasn't the main method of burial for your average Jörgen or Astrid. There wasn't really a main method of Viking burial, in part because the Norse weren't one unified people. But common methods included burying the person's ashes under a mound, burying the body under a mound, or placing the body or their ashes in a ship, which was then buried under a mound. Now here's a trope that's become particularly prevalent in recent years as gender roles continue to blur. We see a lot of shield maidens in our fiction at the moment. Even the Lego set I'm using in a lot of the visuals of this video comes with a shield maiden, very much included. Before I get stuck into this section, I should mention that this topic, more than all the others I'm going to cover in this video, has produced the widest range of opinions among those interested in history, and not just from unqualified planks like me, but actual experts on the period. Some will tell you that shield maidens weren't a thing at all outside of folklore, others will tell you that they did in fact exist, but rarely. Others will claim that there were loads of them running around, binders full of shield maidens all over Scandinavia. So rather than taking this trope and just throwing it out, this section of the video will probably end in a stream of annoying, prevaricating, fence-sitting maybes. The idea of the shield maiden is currently a very captivating and popular idea to depict, as it has been since the Viking Age ended, as well as through the Viking Age itself. The sagas are chock full of shield maidens, and yes, I'm aware the sagas are not first-hand sources and were written after the fact. With history, you really have to work with what you've got. At the very least, the Vikings themselves told stories featuring women warriors. Moving past the realm of mythology and diving headfirst into the more factual written record, we have a couple of accounts of Viking women dressed up for battle and ready to girl boss their way all over some hapless Christians. By a couple, I really do mean I found two, and one was written after the Viking Age was over. But nevertheless, accounts of shield maidens do exist. We have also found potential physical evidence, by which I mean artifacts and graves, not a full-on warrior woman found frozen in ice, although that would be quite cool. We have found these cute figurines at archaeological sites. They look pretty girl-coded and decidedly action-oriented. And then there's this grave site in this bit of Sweden, where a female skeleton was found buried with a sword. Now, this on its own isn't really evidence of anything other than, well, a woman being buried with a sword. A lot of grave sites thought to belong to men have been found with traditionally feminine items such as jewellery and weaving combs, and similarly we found women buried with traditionally masculine items. But in this case it isn't just a sword. There was also an axe, a spear, arrows, stirrups, and 2 shields. That's a full inventory of killing equipment. Now, you can't always tell the biological sex of a person from their skeleton. Could this have been a male warrior that just happened to have killer hips? Nope. DNA evidence has been done on this one, and there was not a Y chromosome in sight. There was a similar discovery in Norway, The lady in this grave even has a nasty facial stab wound to go with her arsenal of weapons. So maybe this idea has some real legs to it. I bet you're pretty convinced now, aren't you, you stupid Well, prepare to be deconvinced. Time to let loose on the fortress of evidence we've built up with the trebuchet of added context. First in the firing line, those figurines I mentioned. Humans love to make statues of things of varying shapes and sizes, and not all of those things are real. Case in point, a lot of these little figures are shown holding cups. According to legend, Odin would present the Valkyries, women whose job it was to guide the dead to Valhalla, with a cup on completion of their quests. So a lot of these cup-bearing fellaettes are probably depictions of them. Then there's the impracticality of some of the designs, like this one found in Harby? Look at that impressive ponytail. Remember what I said about how an enemy in battle would gladly grab horns on a helmet if given the chance? They probably wouldn't have any qualms against grabbing this long bit of trailing head string either. Speaking of helmets, where's hers? See, a figure like this would probably be more likely a depiction of an idealised warrior woman of folklore. In fact, some people think this particular one could be another Valkyrie. This isn't to say there weren't any statuettes of non-fictitious shield maidens. The overall point here is that just because there's a statue made of something, the subject did not necessarily exist. Next on the chopping block, there are written accounts. Now, I don't take any issue with the written accounts themselves, but I'm going to point out that a lot of our more comprehensive accounts of the Vikings don't mention shield maidens at all. If shield maidens were running rampant all over Europe alongside the hairier variety of Viking, we would probably expect them to be mentioned far more than they are in written sources. There'd certainly be a noteworthy detail. Lastly, the burial examples. I don't actually have much to counter these, except to point out that we have not yet found many of them, and sometimes people are buried with symbolic items rather than the ones they would use in a practical way. But I generally find the graves quite compelling, and so do lots of people studying this stuff. Momentarily putting aside the questions of whether or not shield maidens existed in any substantial way, I think it's worth pointing out that something that sets the Vikings apart from other cultures at the time is that they didn't seem to find the idea of a woman warrior inappropriate or distasteful. Women in battle do appear in their folklore far more frequently than the folklore of other cultures at the time. Right, let's make some kind of summary to this rambling mess of a chapter. Okay, based on what I've been presented with, I personally reckon that shield maidens were a real but rare occurrence in the Viking Age. I do not think there were longboats full of them. In fact, I think there was probably far less than one per longboat. Less than one per fleet of longboats, in fact. But I think some did exist. Really, on this one, we should defer to the experts, all of whom completely disagree. The iconic image of a berserker, losing all control, swinging their axes wildly while frothing at the mouth, unable to differentiate friend from foe, thrashing and screaming and shield biting and other loony behaviour on the battlefield, all down to taking some kind of psychotropic drug. Pop culture is a lot less riddled with this trope than the last one. The most prominent example I can think of is the manga Vinland Saga, but I still get the sense that this one is more widely held as fact by more people than shield maidens, skull cups and horned helmets are. Mushrooms, specifically fly agaric, the real classic cartoony looking mushroom. That's the drug this Swedish theologian was peer pressuring us into associating with berserkers, way back in 1784. A century later, Fredrik Schubler, a Norwegian botanist, decided to keep this idea going. Berserkers gorged on mushrooms to induce a frenzied state. It was a fact. Shut up, deal with it. Then, this historian of Norse medicine came on the scene, and decided to just say no to the mushroom theory. Instead, he argued that the frenzied state was completely self-induced. In 1956, Howard Fabing tested the effects of fly agaric intoxication on prisoners. Yes, of course they were volunteers, it was all definitely above board and definitely ethical, so shut up. He reported that the prisoners felt a bit restless, not quite an uncontrolled frenzy. They also became drowsy, twitchy, numb, and nauseous. A perfect condition for the battlefield. If your aim is to make the enemy spare you out of pity, of course. So mushrooms can get right in the bin. What about alcohol? I feel like I shouldn't even have to point out why getting your soldiers blind drunk before a battle isn't the best tactical move, though I suppose alcohol is a semi-reliable trigger of uncoordinated flailing violence. This theory was splashed onto the scene by Hans Jacob Will, yet another theologian. If any Scandinavian theologians are listening, can you please keep your theories about berserkers to yourself? Thank you. A plant called henbane kept sprouting up during research. It doesn't seem to be a very widely held theory, But the idea that this hallucinogenic weed is what caused all that is totally a thing. I'm personally not convinced at all, but they have found henbane seeds at a Viking site in Firecut, and we know that henbane was used across Europe for millennia. Nothing in any written sources from or just after the Viking Age mentions any drugs or other substances being taken to induce berserker battle frenzy, but I'd say henbane is probably the least unlikely cause out of all the bizarre shit we've covered here. Anyone who is an avid watcher of the History Channel show Vikings will be familiar with a particularly vicious version of this torture technique, but the practice has been portrayed in many other depictions of Vikings. Put simply, for those blissfully unaware of what a blood eagle is, we have two differing descriptions of the practice. The first involves cutting the image of an eagle into the victim's back, kind of like when you draw a funny picture on someone when you're putting sunscreen on them, only with much less of a chance to cause cancer. The second is considerably more graphic, so brace yourself. The second method of the blood eagle involves cutting open the flesh on the victim's back, separating their ribs from the spine and ripping them open, then pulling the lungs through the resulting hole, making them look like they have a very fleshy, bloody and underdeveloped set of wings. All this will be done supposedly while the victim is alive. It's very dramatic, over the top, morbidly fascinating, and plays right into the stereotype of the violent, murderous Viking. And let's not pretend the Vikings did nothing to earn that reputation. And very distressingly, though we have no concrete evidence for the blood eagle, there is a chance it did in fact exist. Though frankly I well hope not, because what the I mean, go back and listen to my description, just why? The idea for this form of torture comes from post-Viking Age accounts from Christian cultures. People with a vested interest in making pagan people look less civilized, and people whose prejudices were likely to make them accept what they were told about pagans. The real problem with the idea of this practice is that we don't have any contemporary sources from the Viking Age itself, and not a shred of evidence for the practice in any grave sites, Nordic art, or archaeological items. Alongside all this, as you can imagine from the description of the second version in particular, this form of torture would be somewhat medically difficult to perform without quickly killing the victim, especially when you don't have surgical equipment, or people specifically trained in the art of delicately opening people up. I'm going to be brief with this one. Not because the topic doesn't warrant much discussion, but because the script is already really bloated and, frankly, I'm getting sick of writing it. Probably the most popular enduring myth about the Vikings, if it is indeed a myth, is the image of a warrior covered in an elaborate network of blue runes and other vaguely Norse-flavoured symbols. I think I've seen this trope in every single fictional Viking story I've come across in the last decade. The current crop of writers, directors and game developers have collectively decided that a tattooed Viking is both the dog's and the cat's pyjamas. But is it something that existed? Or just something that looks cool? Well, to start with, we only have one measly source for tattooed Vikings, from Arabic writer and traveller Ibn Fadlan. Told you he'd pop up later. In his writings about the time he spent with the Rus, he describes the Viking men as being covered with drawings from the tips of their fingers to their necks. Note that I didn't use the word tattoos there. That's because Ibn Fadlan didn't either. He used a word that could have referred to tattoo designs, but could just as well have referred to paint or makeup or any other way of colouring yourself in. Besides this one reference to what may have been tattoos among one group of Vikings, we don't have anything. No tattooing tools have been found, the Norse did not depict themselves in art or sculpture with tattoos, and none of the groups they pillaged ever once wrote down. And they had all these funny lines scrolled all over them. Ibn Fadlan is the only possible source. If tattoos were indeed a thing in Viking culture, they were probably not very common. God, this script is so long. Shame on me for that. This should have been more concise. Next time will not be as bad, promise. Anyway, that's our last myth. Now you can have great fun condescendingly correcting your friends when they talk about any of the topics we've covered. Please give me a subscribe. If you do, my wife might decide not to leave me after all. Plus it means you'll actually be able to find the channel in future if you forget the name. One last thing, please don't use this video as a source for anything important. Bye! Man, I love this Lego set. I love building it. Love filming with it. Best Lego set ever. I'm going to be 30 this year.